Continuing on where we left off in the last movie, we now want to look at adjusting color in Camera Raw. However, in the last movie, we clicked OK in Camera Raw, and that imported this CR2 image, this raw camera image, into our After Effects project. So once you've imported a raw image, the way to open it back up in Camera Raw is to select it in the project panel and either go to Edit, Edit Original, or use the keyboard shortcut Command E or Control E on the PC. And assuming that you don't have your RAW files associated to be opened by some other application on your computer, it will open back up in Camera Raw. There's a few interesting ways to play with color here. We have temperature and tint. And as you can see here, because this interface in Camera Raw is just so amazing, if we drag it to the left, it's going to be a little bit cooler, a little bit more blue. Let me take off the highlight clipping so we can see what that's really looking like here. And likewise, we can drag it to the right to warm it up a little bit and make it a little bit more yellow. If you go really far out to the right on temperature, you're going to add a very antique type look, a little 70s look to it. That's not really what I want for the snow, so I'm going to take this back to where it was. Also, we could fine tune the color tint that we're adding by adjusting tint, and we can add green or magenta. Down here at the bottom in this area, below clarity that we talked about in the last movie, we have vibrance and saturation. Now, saturation increases the intensity of all colors. Vibrance does as well, but it's more subtle, and it's especially more reverent, I guess we could say, or more careful about flesh tones. So as we increase the vibrance here, her skin tone is not getting as crazy orange as it might get with saturation. The colors are much more intense and vibrant, but they're not as garish as they can get with saturation. So again, here's saturation, and look at her skin tones. They're just awful and super fake. And when we increase vibrance, it does increase the vibrance or saturation, but her skin tones are still very believable. Now let's take these back to their defaults, somewhere in that ballpark. I want to go back up here to the top. Right now, and in the last movie also, we've been looking in this basic tab. But all of these different tabs at the top are different categories of settings that you can play with in Camera Raw. So I want to go to this zigzaggy line over here, HSL/grayscale. HSL stands for Hue, Saturation, Luminance. In this tab, it's like we have a better version of hue saturation. Let's say, for example, we want to adjust the color of her jacket. That's kind of a blue. So if we grab the blue slider while we're looking at the hue tab here, then we could make it a little bit more cyan, or we could make it a little bit more purple. Likewise, we can go ahead and click on magentas to change the tone of her mittens. Now the color there is not as intense, so it's not as drastic of a change, but if we take the magenta slider over to the left, then now we have a purple jacket and purple mittens. So essentially then, each of these sliders is saying, what color do you want this color to be? So for reds, it's saying, what color do you want the reds to be? Now you notice that we don't have the same control as with hue saturation. In other words, we can't make magentas greens, but we can move them and keep it a very believable change. Next, let's go over to the saturation tab. Again, it's asking you, what do you want the saturation to be for each of these color values? So if we want to bring out the intensity of the purples, then we can drag purples to the right. See, we've made it more saturated. Same thing with magentas. We can make those mittens a little bit more saturated or desaturated if we want to. And finally, we can go over to the luminance tab and play with the brightness of each color. So if we want to darken the purples a little bit, so it's a little bit deeper of a purple, we can drag that to the left. If we want to brighten it up, we can drag it to the right. Same thing with magentas or any other color. Now, as I mentioned in the last chapter, I'm a big fan of the hue saturation effect, but I'm even a bigger fan of the HSL grayscale area here in Camera Raw. I love how it's more visual, it's easier to see what you're doing, it's laid out in a little bit more organized way, and for whatever reason the results just end up usually looking better. Or at least that's been my experience. Another thing we could do in this HSL grayscale tab is click Convert to Grayscale. Then we could adjust how these colors convert to gray. So let's say the purples or the blues, her jacket was blue for example, we can make these areas brighter or darker. Basically, that will play with our conversion to grayscale, almost like the black and white effect in Photoshop, if you're familiar with that. Now, I should also point out over here on this tab, we have a tone curve. It's like having curves built into Camera Raw here. You could use parametric where you're using the triangles at the bottom, kind of like levels, or you can go to point and you can actually have a curve just like curve. So that functionality is built into Camera Raw also. Now, in the latest version of Camera Raw 5, the version that ships with After Effects CS4, We have some new image editing features here that allow us to do some really cool things that we can't do in After Effects. And as I mentioned in the first movie in this chapter, that's really one of the things that makes Camera Raw so viable and such a great asset to users of After Effects. So we're going to look at that in the next movie.